Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. You're probably here because you love Remix. Well, me too. Have you ever had a situation like this? It's Friday, you've deployed a new version of your app to production, you're on your way back home, and you get a call from your boss and he tells you production is down, and you push code that throws an error and that isn't handled. Yes? No? Well, in either case, let's talk about how to stop that from happening in Remix. Alright, so before we get into error handling, if you haven't already, I would highly recommend you watch my routing video, where I go over how routing works in Remix, and also all the types of routes you can have in your Remix project. And this is really important because you need to understand how routing works before you can understand how error handling works. So I'll be adding a card on the top right or somewhere, and you'll be able to check out the video that I'm talking about. After you're done with that, you come back here and let's go over error handling. If you already know how routing works, then perfect. Let's go over the error handling now. Alright, so the first thing we need to understand is there are two kinds of errors that can happen in Remix. The first one is if you throw an error. If you throw an error, what's going to happen is it's going to break through your loaders and actions and end up in the nearest error boundary. So what this means is if you have an error in products, it's going to throw and it's going to end up in the nearest error boundary. In this example here, we have no error boundaries, which means this error that was thrown in products is going to crash your application, and we really don't want that to happen, do we? Or maybe we do, maybe we want our users to suffer. And another thing that's really important to note here is that even if you throw responses instead of errors, error boundaries are gonna catch them. So what's important here is to know that error boundaries catch both responses and errors in your application, originating either from loaders or actions. So you can use them for both. It doesn't matter where the error or the response originated from. So if we want to protect our dashboard here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add an error boundary to the dashboard, and after that's added, the dashboard is going to be protected from throwing errors and responses, but everything under dashboard is also going to be protected. So this means that both the users and the products are going to be protected. So this means if either users, products, or dashboard throw an error or a response, the error boundary that's in the dashboard is going to catch that and handle it. So this means when you add an error boundary to somewhere, both the route that you've added it to and all its children are protected. And if you might have guessed, because we haven't added anything to root, if something goes bad in the root, this is going to crash and our user won't see a fancy UI, is going to see something really horrible. A blue screen of that, but the browser edition. So if we don't want that to happen, we can also add an error boundary to the root, and then everything in the application is protected. So if you add an error boundary to your root TSX file, it's going to be a generic one that handles your whole application. So that means if you even remove the dashboard error boundary from here, it's still going to protect your whole application because you have one in the root. And that's a great way to segment your error boundaries. So for example, if you have a generic one in root, you can have a more specific one in the dashboard, and then you can show a different UI to the user, maybe display some more specific information depending on his role or something like that. It's really up to you. So the important thing to take away from this is the fact that the root here protects your whole application. And that's a really neat trick if you want to quickly protect your whole application without going granular or wanting to just prototype stuff and then add granular error handling later on. Alright, now that we have all of this covered, now let's go into code and let me show you how this works in code, how you can handle errors, what's going to be thrown and caught where, and some neat little tricks you can use to enhance your error handling. So, to show you error handling, I'm going to be using my repository I used in the view transition videos, so the one with the Pokemon, and let's see how error handling works. So, I'm here in my root TSX file, and I want to add a generic error handler here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to use remix forge to insert an error boundary here. So remix forge automatically adds the imports for use route error and is route error response, but both of these come from remix.run React. So now that we have the error boundary here, something I wanted to go over is the fact that before Remix version 2, we had two components that were exported from each file. One of them was called error boundary and the other one was called catch boundary. So how they used to work is if you threw an error, you would end up in the error boundary, obviously, and then you had another catch boundary that caught responses. So they were fragmented into two, and you either went into the error boundary or the catch boundary. So what the Remix team did with version 2 is they merged both of them into the error boundary, and how you handle responses that were thrown, you import isRoute error response here, and then you check if the error here is of that type. And what's cool about this is the error gets type narrowed into the correct type, so you have the data, you have the status and the status text here. So if you threw, for example, a 404, this would be a status 404, and the data here would be whatever you threw with your response. So for example, if you threw a user here, the data would be filled with the user. So if you want to do some granular error handling, for example, show different screens depending on the user, you could throw user with the data and then do more granular stuff here. For example, if error.data.user something, do something. Alright, now that we have that covered, we know that the code here is the old catch boundary, which means if we go through this, it means the loaders or the actions threw an error. So this means if we are here, there is an error. And now let's actually change these two. So I'll make this have a background of yellow 500, and I know it's probably a horrible color, but I just want to show you what happens when you throw something. So I'll add something like error status and error status text here, and here instead of the yellow we'll add background red because it's an error. And what we're gonna do here is we're gonna just say error.message. And because the error is of type unknown, because it is, you have no idea what was thrown. For now, we'll just type this as any, but what you should do here is basically check if the error has a message and then show it. You can do that with TypeScript guards. For example, you could do if error instance of error, then return the message. Or actually, we're just gonna do that instead, and then here we're gonna do something really generic. For example, I don't know, your app died, contact your developers and tell them to do a better job. Alright, and let's save this and let's run the application now. So this is version 2.4.1 and this is running on Wheat, but this doesn't matter because if you're using anything over 2, this is going to be identical. And now let's actually throw a response first here. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm going to insert a loader. So I'm going to use Remix Forge again here. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna, instead of returning something, I'm going to throw an error. So this is an error. And we're gonna save this. And as you can see, it threw an error. And now let's go back to our browser and see what we have. Alright, now that we look at our browser here, we can see that what was rendered was only a div with the class background red and the message this is an error. So this is what we threw in our loader and this is what was rendered. So if you might have noticed, this is not an HTML document and we only rendered a div. And this was on purpose just to show you what happens. So when you throw an error and the error goes into the catch boundary, the catch boundary is going to replace whatever the UI is on the current route with the error boundary. Which means if you threw an error on the root of your application, it's going to replace your whole layout with this. So you need to be careful with this, because if we look at the console tab here, we can see that the error was thrown. It was a 500, and because we replaced the whole UI with this, so this validate DOM nesting error doesn't really matter because this is not valid HTML. This means that we really need to be careful and handle our errors in a way that the layout doesn't break. So let's go back to the code and let's fix this so we can see the whole HTML document instead. Alright, as we already said, we need to render the whole layout instead of the div here. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna create a component that's going to be reusable. We're going to call it layout, and we're not gonna export it because we only want to use it here. And Copilot is being really helpful here because this is the exact signature I want. And we're just gonna let it complete, but this is not what I want. What I want here is this. So I'm gonna copy this and paste it here. And then what we're gonna do is we'll allow for everything here. And we're gonna throw out outlet here. And we're gonna replace it with children. And then we're gonna wrap the app in the layout. Whoops. And then we're gonna delete everything and just leave the outlet here. And in here, what we're gonna do is we're going to replace all three of these with the layout. We're going to save this. And also what we're gonna do is, before we save this again, is we're going to move the scripts and the live reload into the actual app itself, because we don't want this to be inside of the layout for the errors. And then we're gonna save that. And now if we head into the browser, you can see that we have our old layout, our scripts for the styling are loaded, and here we don't have anything besides the get error here. So this means that when we were in the loader for this route, we got the status 500 and this got logged here. And if we look at the HTML here, it's correct. And furthermore, this here is our error boundary. So basically what we rendered here. And you can see it in the UI here. So this is an error is rendered. So we've successfully defended our whole application from errors. And let's go back to the code and let's throw a response now. Alright, so now we're back in the code, and here instead of throwing an error, let's throw a response. So instead of throwing just a regular response, I'm going to throw a JSON response. And what I'm gonna do here is say it's status 500, and I'm going to have message this is an error originating from the loader in root by throwing a response. And let's also add this. So let's say the user has a role of admin, and coincidentally he's also named admin. So his parents didn't really love him as a child, and they decided to name him as a role privilege. So now let's save this and see what happens in the browser now. As you can see in the browser, our error is yellow now because we threw a response and the status is 500. And this means the error boundary caught the response. So something to keep in mind here is we threw a user as well. So let's actually change this to do something else depending on the fact if the user is an admin or not. So now let's go back to VS Code, and the first thing we're gonna do is create a user type. So for example, let's say the user is an object that has a name, which is a string, and a role which is either an admin or an user. what we're gonna do here is we're gonna create another type guard. So what type guards are special functions that allow you to basically guard something with a type. So whenever the if check passes, inside of the if check, the type is going to be narrowed to whatever you were checking. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna create isUser, and the value is going to be unknown, and there is a special kind of syntax here, which is value is user, and this tells TypeScript that the value is of type user if this is returned properly. So what we're gonna do here, so let's implement this now. So as I said, if this function returns true, it means the user is of type user, and if it returns false, it's not. So because we have no idea what the value is, we have to guard it by checking that it's of type object. And what we're gonna do here is we're gonna say if it's not an object or a value, do our early return. We're going to check if the name property is inside of value, and that the type of value dot name is a string, and we're going to return this as well. And then we're gonna do the same thing for the role here. And then we're gonna say it's true because the checks have passed. So we just check that it's a string here. We don't really check that the role is the correct type, but you get the point. So the idea is to narrow the type. So now that we narrow the type, we're going to say here if isUser, because we threw a response, it will have data here. This means that the error data is a user. So what we're gonna do here is say user is equal to error data, and if I hover over this, you can see it's of type user. And the cool thing that we can do here is say if the user role is an admin, we're going to return something different. So we're gonna return, actually we'll change this to yellow. Whoops, I forgot the L. And we're gonna say username is an admin, they should know better. And thank you, Copilot, that's actually a cool sentence. And we'll also show the user.role here, but it's an admin, but you get the point. And then we're going to say error.status and the error status text here. And let's save this and go to the browser and see what we have done. Before we go back to the browser, I realized I made a little mistake here. So the user is not returned with the error.data here. It's returned inside of the data object as a user. So because if we look at the loader here, we're throwing an object with nested properties of message and user. So what we're gonna do is we're going to change it so it's not throwing the message and the user. We're just gonna throw the user object directly. So let's just change it to be a little bit more clear. So let's say this is a dummy user you fetch from a database or whatever, and then we save it here. And now if I save this and go back to the browser, what we're gonna see is if I refresh this, we can see that we get admin is an admin, they should know better, admin 500. So basically this is our username here, this is our user.role, and this is our user status. So this means that we successfully guarded our error boundary and we showed a different response depending on the user. Alright, now that we've done this, let's go over to pokemon.pokemon.info. What we're gonna do here is the following. So we're going to throw an error, and for starters, let's just say, whoops, I broke it. And then let's add an error boundary with Remix Forge again. And what we're gonna do here is say class name of background red 500. Let's set the height to 40 so it's a little bit more visible. And let's just say here something went wrong. And the error message, whatever, let Copilot do our work for us. And as we said, this is still something you need to type guard. So what we're gonna do here is we're not gonna show the message for now because we just want to see what's gonna happen, and let's save this. And now what we're gonna do is, because we are not throwing in root anymore, let's remove this throw JSON here and let's return null for now, we don't really care. And let's save this, and now let's go back to our Pokemon application and see what's gonna happen when we navigate to this page. Alright, so because we removed the thrown error from the root, now we can see that the root is working. And if we go to Venusaur here, and then we click on any of these Pokemon, we're going to go into the error boundary again, because we will throw an error whenever we land in the loader for these pages. And now if I click here, you can see that we get something went wrong here. And this is the error boundary of the Pokemon.$Pokemon.info, and this is rendered instead of the UI for the Pokemons. So if I remove the thrown error and I save it, you're going to see the Ivysaur here. If I revert it and save it, it's going to throw the error boundary. As you can see, it's really granular, and you can do whatever you want, and you can even return some data that was fetched and then show that instead. So for example, let's go back to the code and let's do something different. So instead of throwing this, let's throw something else. Let's throw a response again. So now that we're back in the code, let's imagine this scenario. Let's say you don't want to throw an error, you want to redirect the user somewhere. So how we're gonna do that is we're going to throw a new response, and there's a special kind of response that's a redirect response. It has the status of 302, and the headers, it has a location to where you want to throw the user. So let's say when the user lands on this page, we want to throw him back to the root. So we can delete this and throw this. And let's save this, and let's go back to the browser and see what's going to happen when we throw this. Alright, we're back in the browser now, and let's see what's going to happen when we click one of these Pokemon. So if you remember, I added it to the Pokemon info, and whenever I click one of these Pokemon, we're going to navigate to this page. So I'm going to click Bulbasaur here, and as you can see, it didn't go into the error boundary, but we ended up here on the root. So what's going on here? Well, there's a special kind of response I've already told you about called a redirect response. So what redirect responses do is they redirect the user to a different URL, and instead of going to the error boundary, you basically go to those new loaders and they handle a new request for you. So what you can do is, for example, if the user is not logged in, you can throw the user to the login page and it's not going to crash. It's just going to render a different UI depending on where you throw the user. And if you go back to the code, what's important to note here is that this is the equivalent of throwing a redirect function from Remix. So you can just say this, and it's a utility that returns a response that is equivalent to what we had before. So basically, it's a utility that's going to throw this for you, and it's going to redirect the user somewhere. And that's a neat thing to know what's going on under the hood, instead of just relying on a redirect and just wondering how that works. So what's important to take away from here is that you can redirect users, and these are special kind of responses that are thrown that do not go into the error boundary, but rather they go to whatever URL you specified and they don't crash the application. So if you want to redirect the user somewhere else, you throw a redirect. If you want the user to end up in an error boundary, you just throw a response that's not a redirect, so either a 400, 500, 200, it doesn't really matter. You can even throw 200s, it doesn't really matter as long as it's thrown. And that's going to allow you to be very specific in where you want the user to land. And there's also another kind of error handling I haven't talked about, and those are action error handles. And what these are basically, let's say you have a form, and I'm going to use Remix Forge again. It's a VS Code extension for Remix. If you want to download it and give it a go, it's really useful. Full disclosure here, I created it, so I've just added everything that's useful for me, and it's great for generating boilerplate code. Anyhow, if I add a remix section here, and let's say you don't want your user to go into the error boundary because you, for example, had form data, and then let's say you got the Pokemon, but this Pokemon was not right. So let's say if Pokemon is, I don't know, equal to Pikachu, you don't really like Pikachu, you don't want him to go through. What you can do here, instead of throwing, you can return a JSON response. So if we import this, we're going to return a JSON that's going to say error, Pikachu is not allowed, I hate Pikachu, for example. And I'm pretty sure that's a crime in most countries, but for the sake of the argument, let's say this is the error that you send. So what this is gonna do is, whenever you send data to the action, is going to say if Pokemon is Pikachu, I'm going to return it, otherwise I'll return null. But let's say we save this information somewhere, and what you can do here is, because data is returned from the action, you can use action data. And what this allows you to do is, when you type this to be type of action, when we hover over this, this will either be null, undefined, so these are the cases when you haven't actually submitted anything yet, or they can be a response of this type. So for example, if I say data.error, it's going to be whatever was returned from the action. So because we returned JSON here with the error, it's going to say Pikachu is not allowed, I hate Pikachu here. And then what you can do in the UI, let's say, imagine you had an input. So for example, input type text, name Pokemon, we can say if data.error, show the error to the user. And that's how you can handle form submission errors, but keep in mind that this is usually useful for forms and nothing else, because there's rarely a situation where you want to return JSON as errors. You usually want to throw the user somewhere or something like that. But something also to keep in mind is, if you throw here, let's say a redirect, this is not going to be the type of this. So you can see that this hasn't changed, because whenever you throw something, the TypeScript doesn't register it as a return type. So whenever you don't want this to be polluted by some other error handling, the best thing you can do is throw this, and then what's going to happen is this is going to redirect the user, or this will end up somewhere in the error boundary. And then whenever you use it here, this is going to be of pure type and it's going to work. So that's also something to keep in mind. So instead of returning this, you should throw it. But this might have not been a great example, because redirects don't pollute the type anyways, but JSON does. So example, if you throw this, it's still going to be of the same type, but if you return this, it's going to say it's a string, because we return string here. It's going to say it's a JSONify object of errors because we returned it here, or it's going to be null or undefined because we return null in this case and it's undefined by default. So that's a neat trick you can use to throw the users into the error boundary if something happens that shouldn't happen. So for example, let's say you checked in the database and the Pikachu doesn't exist at all. The user sends something like an ABC string. Then we throw the user to the error boundary telling him, yeah, this doesn't work at all. Refresh the page or bother somebody else with your fake information. And that's all you need to know about error handling in Remix. Now you know how to throw errors, to throw responses, when to throw them, when to return them, and generally how error boundaries handle errors. And that's it for today. Thank you for watching another video of mine, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below, or if you liked the video, also feel free to share it with others. I hope it helped you in some way, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, and see you in the next one. Bye!